The children were singing again. Sarah Matthews jerked awake in her Atlanta apartment, heart hammering as the phantom melody faded. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, ... Single quotes, 12 young voices, sweet and innocent, carrying across 30 years of guilt and silence. She checked her phone, 3:17 a.m., the same time the fire had started at Camp Firefly. Her hands shook as she reached for the water glass on her nightstand. The nightmares came every August, like clockwork, but tonight felt different, more vivid, more desperate. She could still smell smoke, still hear screams mixing with that haunting camp song. Jenny Morrison's gap-toothed smile flashed behind her eyelids, then dissolved into flames. The manila envelope from Hutchins & Associates sat on her kitchen counter, delivered 2 weeks ago, but still unopened. Sarah knew what it contained, the final piece of Great Aunt Meredith's estate. The deed to Camp Firefly, the place she'd sworn never to think about again. The place where she'd failed them all on one horrible summer night in 1994. Her phone buzzed with a text from her fiancé Marcus, another nightmare. "Maybe it's time to see someone about this." Sarah almost laughed. She was someone people saw, a respected child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery. The irony burned like acid. How could she help others heal when her own wounds had never stopped bleeding? She walked to the window overlooking Peachtree Street. Even at this hour, Atlanta hummed with life, traffic lights blinking in rhythm, the distant wail of sirens, the city that never truly slept. But beneath the urban symphony, she still heard them singing. 12 children who'd trusted her, who'd died while she froze in terror, paralyzed by the sight of flames consuming Cabin 7. The envelope seemed to pulse with malevolent energy from the kitchen counter. Sarah had avoided Pine Ridge County for 15 years, but the past was calling her home. The children were calling her home. This time, she couldn't run away. This time, she had to face what she'd done, and what she'd failed to do on the night everything changed forever. Inside, cobwebs draped the reception area like party streamers for a macabre celebration. The camp's motto still hung crookedly on the wall, "Where every child shines bright." Sarah's stomach clenched. 30 years ago, 12 children had stopped shining forever. The official report blamed faulty wiring in Cabin 7, but Sarah knew better. She'd been there. Her footsteps echoed as she explored the main floor. The dining hall stretched empty, long tables covered in dust sheets like corpses. The industrial kitchen beyond sat frozen in time, pots still hanging from their hooks. Sarah touched nothing, afraid to disturb whatever peace the abandoned camp had found. But peace felt elusive here. She climbed the creaking stairs to what had been the counselor's quarters. Her old room faced the lake, and despite herself, Sarah was drawn to the window. Mirror Lake stretched before her, its surface dark and still. No ripples disturbed its glassy perfection. No laughter carried across the water. Just silence that felt almost accusatory. On the far shore, the burned remains of Cabin 7 stood like a blackened tooth. Even 30 years later, nothing had grown where the cabin once stood. The ground remained barren, a scar on the landscape that refused to heal. Sarah pressed her palm against the cool window glass, remembering the night that changed everything. The night she'd failed them all. A sound from below made her freeze. Footsteps. Impossible. She was alone. Sarah held her breath, listening intently. Nothing but the settling of old wood and her own rapid heartbeat. Just nerves, she told herself. This place would make anyone jumpy. She needed to focus on why she'd come, to catalog the property and prepare it for sale. But as she turned from the window, something caught her eye. A small light flickered near the lake's edge, brief, blue-white, like a camera flash. She looked again, but saw only gathering shadows. The sun was setting earlier than she'd expected, and the woods were already claiming the camp. Time moved differently here, she remembered. Sarah decided to check the cabins before darkness fell completely. She grabbed a flashlight from her car and headed down the familiar path that wound through the pines. Cabins 1 through 6 stood in various states of decay, their screen doors hanging loose, their roofs sagging under years of neglect. She avoided Cabin 7 entirely. Cabin 3 had been hers that final summer. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, her flashlight beam revealing 8 empty bunk beds arranged in perfect rows. Dust covered everything, but she could almost hear the ghost of children's voices, bedtime whispers, homesick tears, excited chatter about tomorrow's activities. The silence pressed against her eardrums. Something white caught her attention on one of the beds. Sarah approached cautiously, her light revealing a child's drawing on yellowed paper. A crude stick figure family stood in front of a cabin, all holding hands. My camp family was written in crayon at the bottom, with Jenny, age 8, in careful block letters. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Jenny Morrison had been one of the 12 who died in the fire. Sarah remembered her clearly. Pigtails, gap-toothed smile, always the first to volunteer for activities. The drawing hadn't been here 30 years ago, Sarah was certain. Someone had placed it recently, but who? The estate lawyers swore no one had keys to the property. A whisper of sound made her spin around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" Her voice cracked. No response. Just the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through broken screens. But the temperature had dropped noticeably, her breath now visible in the beam of her flashlight. In Georgia, in August. Sarah backed toward the door, that familiar childhood fear creeping up her spine. The same fear she'd felt 30 years ago when she'd smelled smoke in the middle of the night. When she'd seen the orange glow across the lake and known, with the terrible certainty of youth, that something irrevocable was happening. Outside, darkness had fallen completely. Her car seemed impossibly far away, and the path back to the lodge twisted through shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees. Sarah quickened her pace, the flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of her. Behind her, a sound like children's laughter drifted on the night air. She ran the final 100 yards to the lodge, not caring how foolish it seemed. Inside, she threw the bolt on the front door and leaned against it, breathing hard. This was ridiculous. She was a grown woman, a professional who dealt with childhood trauma daily. She understood the power of suggestion, the tricks memory could play. But understanding didn't make the fear less real. Sarah climbed to her old room and prepared for bed, trying to focus on practical matters. Tomorrow, she'd take photos for the real estate listing, maybe call a contractor about demolition costs. The camp had served its purpose long ago. Some places were better left as memories. She tried calling Marcus, but her phone showed no signal. Of course, she was in the middle of nowhere. Sarah settled into the sleeping bag she'd brought, leaving the flashlight within reach. Through the window, she could see stars reflecting on Mirror Lake's surface, and for a moment, the view was beautiful again. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of summer days and children's voices. Sarah found herself reliving that last perfect afternoon. Capture the flag in the woods, swimming contests off the dock, ghost stories around the campfire. She'd been head counselor that year, responsible for 43 children. She'd failed them all. A sound woke her in the deep hours of the night, singing, children's voices carrying across the water. Sweet and clear in the darkness. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, ... Single quotes, the camp's traditional evening song, one she'd led countless times around dying campfires. But there was no campfire now, no children. Sarah crept to the window and peered out. Across the lake, near Cabin 7's ruins, small lights danced in the darkness. Not flashlights or fires, but something else entirely. Blue-white orbs that pulsed and swayed like fireflies, but wrong somehow. Too bright, too cold, moving with purpose rather than random flight patterns. The singing continued, growing louder. Sarah recognized individual voices now. Jenny Morrison's slight lisp, Tommy Chin's perpetual hoarseness from talking too much, little Rebecca Walsh, who always sang off-key but with such enthusiasm that no one minded, All the voices of children who'd been silenced 30 years ago. Fear paralyzed her. This wasn't possible. Dead children didn't sing camp songs in the middle of the night. Ghosts were metaphors, symbols of unresolved guilt, not literal entities dancing across midnight lakes. Her rational mind insisted on logical explanations. Teenagers, pranksters, someone trying to scare away potential buyers. But deep in her heart, she knew better. Just as she'd known 30 years ago that something was wrong when she'd smelled smoke, when she'd heard screams and seen flames engulfing Cabin 7, when she'd frozen instead of running to help, paralyzed by terror and the awful certainty that she was too late. The lights across the lake began moving closer, crossing the water's surface without creating ripples. Sarah stumbled backward from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The singing grew louder, more insistent. They were coming for her. Finally, after 30 years of waiting, they were coming to collect what she owed. She grabbed her keys and ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time in her panic. The front door seemed miles away as the singing grew louder still. Sarah's fingers fumbled with the bolt, precious seconds lost, while the children's chorus filled the night air. Behind her, she heard the lodge's front door creak open. Her car started on the third try, headlights cutting through darkness as she reversed frantically. But as she swung toward the dirt road, her beams illuminated them, 12 children standing in a line across the path. Not solid, but not quite transparent either. Caught between worlds, between life and death, between forgiveness and vengeance. Sarah slammed the brakes, her car skidding to a stop mere feet from the ghostly figures. They looked exactly as she remembered. Jenny with her pigtails, Tommy with his thick glasses, Rebecca clutching her worn teddy bear. But their eyes held an emptiness that made her soul recoil. They'd been waiting so long. We've been waiting for you, Miss Sarah. Jenny's voice carried clearly through the windshield, sweet and innocent as ever. You left us. You were supposed to take care of us, but you left us to burn. The other children nodded in unison, their movements synchronized and unnatural. Sarah's throat closed completely. She tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no sound emerged. How could she tell them she'd been 17 and terrified, that she'd smelled smoke and panicked, running to get help instead of checking on them first? That by the time she'd returned with other counselors, Cabin 7 was already an inferno. The man said you'd come back someday, Tommy added, his voice carrying that familiar hoarseness. The man with the matches. He said you knew what really happened, that you saw him but never told. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She had seen someone that night, fleeing through the trees as the fire spread. The memories crashed over her like a tide, a figure in dark clothes, moving away from Cabin 7 just before the screaming started. She'd been frozen with fear, watching from her cabin window as flames consumed the building. Later, she'd convinced herself it was another counselor, someone who'd tried to help. But it hadn't been a counselor. It had been the arsonist, and she'd let him escape. Her silence had protected a killer while 12 innocent children paid the price. The guilt had eaten at her for 30 years, driving her to work with traumatized children, trying to atone for her failure. You have to tell the truth, Rebecca whispered, her teddy bear's button eyes glowing in the headlights. Or we can't rest, and neither can the others. Other children began emerging from the woods, not the 12 who'd died in the fire, but new victims. Children who'd disappeared over the years, claimed by the same evil Sarah had helped escape. The ghostly assembly grew larger as more spirits materialized. Sarah recognized some faces from missing person reports she'd seen over the decades. A boy from Macon who'd vanished during a camping trip. Twin girls from Savannah who'd disappeared from their backyard. The killer had never stopped, and their deaths were on her hands too. Who was he? Sarah finally managed to whisper. The man with the matches. But even as she asked, she knew. The face that had haunted her nightmares for 30 years finally had a name. Harold Brennan. The maintenance worker who'd been fired 2 days before the fire, for inappropriate behavior around the children. Uncle Harry always brought us treats, Jenny said sadly. He said he loved us special. When Miss Meredith sent him away, he got so angry. He said we'd be sorry. He said everyone would be sorry. Sarah remembered now. How could she have forgotten? Brennan had been questioned after the fire, but released for lack of evidence. Her silence had been his alibi. If she'd told police what she'd seen, they would have investigated further. Instead, her guilt and fear had protected a monster, allowing him to kill again and again. The weight of 30 years' worth of victims pressed down on her shoulders like stones. The children began walking closer to her car, their ethereal forms passing through the headlight beams. Sarah's engine sputtered and died, leaving her in darkness, except for their collective glow. "You have to make it right," they whispered in unison. "You have to tell the truth. It's the only way we can rest." Sarah fumbled for her phone, forgetting there was no signal. Even if there had been, who would she call? The police. Harold Brennan was probably dead by now. He'd been middle-aged 30 years ago. The case was closed, the evidence long gone. Her testimony would be dismissed as the ravings of a guilt-ridden woman. "He's still alive," Tommy said, reading her thoughts with supernatural clarity. "Still hurting children. Still free because of your silence. But it's not too late, Miss Sarah. It's never too late to do the right thing." The ghostly children pressed closer, their presence dropping the temperature inside the car. Sarah's breath came in visible puffs as she processed this revelation. Harold Brennan, now in his 70s, was still out there, still hunting. The thought made her physically ill. How many children had died because of her cowardice? How many families had been destroyed by her silence? The number was incalculable, unbearable. "Where is he?" she managed to ask through chattering teeth. The children's forms began to flicker, their energy waning as dawn approached. "Riverside Manor," Jenny whispered, her voice fading. "The children's home outside Valdosta. He's the night janitor. They don't know what he is." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. A children's home. Vulnerable kids with no family to protect them. He'd hidden in plain sight all these years, probably selecting victims from the endless stream of forgotten children who passed through institutional care. Her silence had enabled decades of horror. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the ghostly children began to fade. "Tell the truth," they pleaded in unison. "Make it right. It's the only way to stop him. The only way for all of us to rest." One by one, they dissolved into the morning mist, leaving Sarah alone with her terrible knowledge. She sat in her dead car as the sun rose fully, painting Mirror Lake gold and beautiful once more. Birds sang in the trees, and somewhere a fish jumped, sending ripples across the perfect surface. But the peace was an illusion. It had always been an illusion, built on a foundation of lies and cowardice. Sarah walked back to the lodge and gathered her things. Her car started normally now, as if the night's events had been a fever dream. But she knew better. The children's message burned in her heart. Tell the truth. Stop Harold Brennan. Save the innocents, still in danger. It was 30 years too late, but not too late to matter. The drive to Valdosta took 3 hours, giving Sarah time to plan. She couldn't simply accuse a man based on ghostly testimony, but she could investigate. She could watch. She could gather evidence of current crimes and make sure he never hurt another child. It was the least she could do for the spirits who'd trusted her. Riverside Manor sat on the outskirts of town, a collection of brick buildings that tried to look cheerful but couldn't quite hide their institutional nature. Children played in the fenced yard under staff supervision, their laughter echoing across the parking lot. Innocent joy that needed protecting from the monster hiding among them. Sarah parked across the street and called the facility's main number. "I'm a child psychologist, interested in volunteering," she lied smoothly. "Could I speak with someone about your program?" Within an hour, she had an appointment with the director for the following morning. Sometimes deception served justice. That night, she checked into a nearby motel, and researched everything she could find about Harold Brennan. Public records showed a man with no fixed address until 5 years ago, when he'd started working at Riverside Manor. Before that, a pattern of short-term jobs at youth facilities across Georgia and Alabama, always moving before anyone could get suspicious. She found missing children reports that corresponded to his employment history, a trail of vanished innocence stretching back decades, never from the facilities where he worked directly, but always from nearby areas. He was careful, patient, selecting victims who wouldn't be immediately missed. The perfect predator, enabled by her silence. At 2 a.m., Sarah drove past Riverside Manor again. The building was dark except for a few security lights, but she could see a figure moving inside, someone with a maintenance cart, working the night shift. Harold Brennan, still hunting in the darkness. Still free because she'd been too afraid to tell the truth. The next morning, she met with Mrs. Rodriguez, the facility director. "We're always looking for qualified volunteers," the woman said warmly. "Our children have been through so much trauma. They need positive role models." Sarah nodded, fighting the urge to warn her about the danger lurking in her own building. "Could I see the facilities?" Sarah asked. "I'd like to understand the environment better." As they toured the dormitories and common areas, she memorized the layout, noting security cameras and emergency exits. If she was going to stop Harold Brennan, she needed to understand his hunting ground. That evening, Sarah positioned herself across from Riverside Manor with a camera and a thermos of coffee. She'd decided to document Brennan's movements, build a case the police couldn't ignore. But as midnight approached, she saw something that made her blood freeze, a small figure climbing out a first-floor window. A boy, maybe 10 years old, dropping silently to the ground and running toward the woods behind the facility. Not escaping being lured. Sarah grabbed her phone to call 911, then remembered she had no proof, no evidence except the word of dead children. By the time police arrived, it would be too late. She started her car and followed, headlights off, praying she wasn't already too late. The boy disappeared into the tree line, and Sarah abandoned her car at the forest's edge. She grabbed the flashlight from her glove compartment and plunged into the darkness, following broken branches and disturbed leaves. Voices carried through the night air, a man's low tones and a child's frightened whispers. Sarah moved toward the sound, her flashlight beam dancing wildly as she stumbled through undergrowth. 30 years of guilt and cowardice had led to this moment. She wouldn't fail another child. She found them in a small clearing. Harold Brennan, aged but still recognizable from her nightmares, kneeling beside a terrified boy who couldn't have been older than 8. "It's okay, Jimmy," Brennan was saying in the same gentle voice he'd used at Camp Firefly. "Uncle Harold just wants to play a special game. Stop," Sarah shouted, her flashlight beam catching Brennan in its glare. He spun toward her, his face contorting with rage and recognition. 30 years had aged them both, but some connections transcended time. He knew exactly who she was and why she was there. Well, he sneered, rising slowly. "Little Sarah Matthews, all grown up. I wondered when you'd finally grow a backbone." The boy Jimmy cowered between them, too frightened to move. Sarah kept her light trained on Brennan, her phone ready to record everything he said. "Let him go," Sarah demanded, surprised by the strength in her voice. "It's over, Harold. I know what you did at Camp Firefly. I know what you've been doing ever since. The police are on their way." It was a bluff, but Brennan didn't know that. His eyes darted between Sarah and the tree line. "You don't know anything," he spat. "You were just a scared little girl then, and you're still scared now. You could have stopped me 30 years ago, but you didn't. All those children died because you were a coward. Their blood is on your hands as much as mine." The words hit like physical blows, but Sarah stood firm. "You're right," she said quietly. "I was scared. I failed them, but I won't fail Jimmy." She stepped closer, shielding the boy with her body. "Run, Jimmy. Run back to the building and don't stop." But Jimmy seemed frozen with terror, his wide eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. Brennan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "He won't run," he said confidently. "They never do. Fear is a wonderful thing, Sarah. It keeps secrets buried, lets monsters hide in plain sight. You should know." "Not anymore," Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength. "I'm done being afraid. I'm done keeping your secrets." She pulled out her phone and hit record, making sure the screen was visible. "Tell me about Camp Firefly, Harold. Tell me about the 12 children you murdered." His face went pale in the flashlight beam. "You can't prove anything. It was an electrical fire. Everyone knows that. Faulty wiring, tragic accident. Case closed 30 years ago." But his voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. He could see the phone recording, see the determination in Sarah's eyes. "I saw you that night," Sarah said clearly, loudly, for the recording. "Running from cabin 7 with matches in your hand. I was too scared to tell the truth then, but I'm telling it now. You murdered Jenny Morrison, Tommy Chen, Rebecca Walsh, and 9 other innocent children because they rejected your advances." Brennan's composure cracked completely. "Shut up," he screamed, lunging toward her. Sarah sidestepped, keeping Jimmy behind her, and continued speaking for the recording. "You've been killing children ever since, haven't you? Moving from facility to facility, selecting victims who won't be missed." He stopped his advance, breathing heavily, calculating. In the distance, Sarah heard sirens. Someone must have called in her 911 hang-up from earlier. Help was coming, but not fast enough. Brennan heard the sirens too, and his expression turned desperate, dangerous. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking you with me." And the boy. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a hunting knife, its blade gleaming in the flashlight beam. "Should have minded your own business. Sarah, should have stayed quiet like a good girl." Jimmy finally unfroze, scrambling away from Brennan and toward the tree line. "Run," Sarah shouted, never taking her eyes off the knife. The sirens were getting closer, but not close enough. She was alone with a killer who had nothing left to lose, surrounded by darkness and 30 years of accumulated rage. Brennan advanced slowly, knife held low in a fighter's grip. "I've gotten very good with blades over the years," he said conversationally, quick and quiet. "The children barely feel it." Sarah backed away, phone still recording, flashlight trained on his face. Every word was evidence, every admission, another nail in his coffin. "The children at Camp Firefly fought you, didn't they?" she said, trying to keep him talking. "That's why you used fire instead. Easier to control. But you preferred the knife afterward. More personal, more satisfying." Her words hit home. His eyes flashed with sick pride. "Those little brats got what they deserved," he spat, acting all innocent, then screaming when I showed them special attention. The fire was poetic justice, purification. I watched them burn and felt nothing but satisfaction. The confession was complete, recorded, undeniable. The sirens were very close now, flashlight beams dancing through the trees. Brennan heard them too, and desperation replaced calculation in his eyes. "Time's up," he whispered, raising the knife. Sarah closed her eyes and thought of the 12 children who'd trusted her, who'd waited 30 years for justice. A gunshot cracked through the night air. Brennan stumbled, the knife clattering to the ground as he clutched his shoulder. Police officers emerged from the darkness, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Sarah fell to her knees, the phone still recording, tears streaming down her face. It was over. Finally, impossibly, it was over. The next hours passed in a blur of statements and medical checks and evidence collection. Sarah's recording provided the confession police needed, corroborated by decades of circumstantial evidence linking Brennan to missing children. He was charged with multiple counts of murder, including the Camp Firefly 12. Jimmy was safely returned to Riverside Manor, traumatized but alive. Sarah made sure he was assigned to a trauma specialist, someone who could help him process what had happened. She knew better than anyone how untreated trauma could poison a life, how silence could enable monsters. 3 months later, Sarah stood once again at Mirror Lake, but this time, she wasn't alone. Marcus had driven down from Atlanta, and together they watched contractors prepare to demolish the lodge. The camp would become a memorial park, a place of remembrance rather than tragedy. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked, squeezing her hand. "The insurance money from your aunt's policy could buy us a nice house in Buckhead." Sarah shook her head. Some prices were too high, some histories too important to erase. The children deserved to be remembered properly. That evening, as sunset painted the lake gold, Sarah thought she saw them one last time, 12 small figures standing on the far shore, no longer dancing with desperate energy, but still and peaceful. Jenny raised her hand in farewell, and one by one, they faded into the gathering twilight. Harold Brennan died in prison 6 weeks into his sentence, found in his cell with no signs of violence. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but Sarah knew better. Some debts could only be paid in full, and justice had many forms. The children had finally gotten what they needed: truth, acknowledgement, peace. Sarah returned to Atlanta and her practice, but she was changed. She specialized now in institutional abuse cases, helping children find their voices when adults failed them. She spoke at conferences about the responsibility of witnesses, the courage required to tell difficult truths. On quiet summer evenings, when the air hung thick with humidity and the first fireflies began their ancient dance, Sarah sometimes thought about that last night at Camp Firefly, about children's voices singing in the darkness, about light conquering shadow, about the power of truth to set both the living and the dead free. The last Firefly summer had ended 30 years ago, but its lessons lived on. In every child protected by truth-telling, in every monster stopped by courage, in every witness who chose justice over silence. The children of Camp Firefly had finally found their rest, and Sarah had found her redemption